Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. We're working our way through the second half of this month of January. The college football season has concluded. It was a long one. Penn State on the doorstep of a national title, as we've covered at length on this show and over at Lions247.com, losing by a field goal to Notre Dame in the semifinal down at the Orange Bowl. Ultimately, Notre Dame falls to Ohio State in the national championship game on Monday night. Ohio State, a team that seemed to be pegged for implosion coming out of the month of November, ultimately claiming the national championship and setting up a long offseason in a lot of different campuses, setting the stage for them to try to chase that down next year. Penn State's among them. Still some interesting things to work our way through with this roster and certainly with the coaching staff, and to bring in now Mark Brennan and Daniel Gowan to break a lot of that down. Guys, good to have you back. We had Tyler Calvaruso on our last episode, spent a lot of time reviewing the transfer situation for Penn State, ins and outs of it. We'll do that again, but a common theme of our recent episodes, going back to when you guys were on with me last Tuesday, 8 days ago, is Penn State's looking for a defensive coordinator. Or maybe you're listening to this and it's all been resolved and you're enjoying the coverage of Lions247.com about the new defensive coordinator. I'll default to that. But if you're still listening and it hasn't been filled, it's a really interesting situation, Mark, because, again, Tom Allen was introduced at Clemson, I think, last Wednesday. We're into this Wednesday. There's been a few names that have surfaced, some at the college level, some familiar who've worked under Franklin, who have history at Penn State as players. You've got names at the NFL level who are just finishing up their playoff runs. And so we get to this point now, final week of January just about, and this is one of the more interesting vacancies, I think, across college football. And we'll see if there's other to fill with Notre Dame and Ohio State staff having some decisions to make.
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point there's really no rush, right? I mean, I know it's frustrating for fans, and I know as people in the media who are trying to track this, it's not necessarily the easiest thing to do. But this isn't a situation where you're kind of going into a bowl and you would be able to take advantage of all those practices if you're able to get your next defensive coordinator in place, even if he wasn't serving as a defensive coordinator for the bowl game, just to be on the staff. So I think better off to take your time and make sure you get it right at this point. After such a long season, I don't think there was any reason to rush. They're obviously doing their due diligence. People are doing their due diligence about Penn State. All I know is that if we start mentioning names right now, it will guarantee that it is the guy is announced as soon as we wrap up this podcast. So we're going to be careful, people, but know that as soon as this happens, we'll be diving into a podcast at some point, quickly after it goes down.
And we do have a lot of live updates happening over at Lions 24/7 regarding this coaching search. We have our big classic defensive coordinator official thread that's been rumbling for 8 days now. It is a staple of our site. A lot of energy, a lot of tangents. If you want to dive into that, it'll take you in a lot of directions, but it'll also be the place where you get a lot of nuggets along the way. And we also have one that's a little more streamlined for folks at Lions247.com that's kind of placing our post atop that, and we're updating that post as we learn a little bit more. There was a name that popped up from the NFL coaching ranks on Tuesday. Seemed like the hot name at the time. By the time we sat down to record here on Wednesday, we're told he's no longer on the table. He's his hat's out of the ring. So all of a sudden, Daniel, again, we have a lot of answers on the roster. I think Mark's makes some good points where you're not really in a position time-wise where you've got to go out and recruit guys to campus right now, although you want to be able to be doing that the best you can. But your roster's pretty set for the time being. What do you make of I guess, this pause in defensive leadership, or at least as it's currently constructed on the staff? And additionally, the fact that we continue to hear, I'm going to mention one name, that Anthony Poindexter remains in the mix for this job. A guy who has been with this program for quite some time now, an All-American resume as a player. He interviewed as a head coach at his alma mater a few years back, and we know he's had other programs interested in him as a potential defensive coordinator, certainly as a safeties coach. So when you throw that all on the table right now, where we're at in January 22nd, what do you make of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think Penn State's it's kind of in an interesting spot, and I think also when you look at Penn State's past defensive coordinator transitions, those were in non-playoff years. And so you were taking care of this in December, during that little bit of dead period. But with Penn State making the playoff, having a little bit of a deeper run, this offseason calendar and offseason flow just feels a little bit different. When you talk about the overarching defensive situation, I guess, and you termed it like the absence of leadership or whatever. I mean, James Franklin's done a very nice job of keeping some continuity on that side of the ball over the past couple of years. Terry Smith has been here for all 11 years. Anthony Poindexter just finished his 4th year. Deion Barnes had his 3rd year as a position coach, but 6th year overall. Dan Connor's been here for a couple years. Justin Lustig is the newcomer at this point as the outside linebackers and nickels coach, in addition to special teams coordinator. So I think that, when you look at how Franklin approached replacing Brent Pry with Manny Diaz and then replacing Manny Diaz with Tom Allen, he talks a lot about wanting to look for someone that, isn't going to tear it down to the studs and rebuild it. Someone that can come in, and fit to Penn State's personnel and how they've been recruiting, how they've been developing, how they've been doing things. And I think that Penn State having this infrastructure in place helps with that. So I do think that, while it might feel like it's dragged out to some people, and I know over the weekend was very, very quiet, whether that's a product of the college football playoff, the NFL playoffs, the holiday weekend, whatever it was. I know that some people might be getting a little antsy, but I think that, James Franklin has done a good job of, especially on that defensive side of the ball, of making that more than just the coordinator. I know he likes to talk about, he wants a defensive coordinator who can be the head coach of the defense, but there's a lot more pieces to it than just that defensive coordinator.
And I think what we also hear from James Franklin every time they introduce a new defensive coordinator, every time we ask him about searching for one, is he tries to make it a point that this should be one of the most coveted assistant coach jobs in all of college football. Non-head coaching jobs, to be the guy who's calling defensive plays for Penn State. That should be really near the top of the ladder in the college football world. And you look at the results that the recent defensive coordinators have had and where it's kind of taken them in their careers. Or Tom Allen's a little bit different of a scenario and how that played out, but the performance was there to help Penn State get to the Final Four of the college football playoff. We'll have a lot of time to break down what's next for this Penn State defense and what the play caller is going to be dealing with once we hear who that is. And when that happens, we'll come to you with another podcast. Of course, the first place you'll want to check is lions247.com for our immediate reaction. But guys, I want to get your reaction to some news that surfaced since we last spoke on the podcast. Tyler Calvaruso and I, when dealing with some of the transfer updates, dealt with it. But Omari Evans and Harrison Wallace both hitting the portal. Harrison Wallace has found his next home. He's going to Ole Miss. I don't believe we have an announcement from Omari Evans. Correct me if I'm wrong. We've heard some things, maybe Texas Tech being in play there to get him back home. We'll see how it works out for him. But they won't be in Happy Valley any longer. Mark, we spent a lot of time over the course of the year and invested quite a bit in our postmortem of the playoff run for Penn State at the receiver position. We now know that these two are not part of the equation. That leaves Liam Clifford, 18 catches this past season, 39 catches on his career, as the only member of the receiver room with double-digit career catches in a Nittany Lions uniform. Tyler Warren's gone after a 102-catch season. So where does this leave the Nittany Lions offensive plan, and particularly a passing attack with that senior quarterback, Drew Aller?
Well, I mean, to me, it shows that James Franklin is committed to Marcus Hagans, right? I mean, not long after the season ended, we saw Hagans with Franklin out in California, doing whatever the heck he was doing. So is this a turning of the page? I mean, it sure looks like it, right? I mean, these were two guys, unless I'm wrong, I think I'm correct on this, but they weren't initially recruited by Marcus Hagans. And now you're going to basically, outside of Liam Clifford, have a bunch of guys who were recruited by Marcus Hagans, along with the two transfers who are coming in. So to me, that's what that's saying. Whether you think that's a good thing or whether you think it's a bad thing, that's the direction they're going. The one thing I would say about Marcus Hagans is, when it comes to being an assistant coach, what was the old Bill Parcells thing? If you're going to make the meal, you'd like to buy the groceries. And maybe this is that situation where Franklin's saying, okay, we're going to let you go with the guys who you recruited and guys that you were able to bring in through the transfer portal and see how it works. Whether that's the right decision or not, I don't know. I mean, I look at a team that's coming out of a bowl game where it was the only, what was the stat the CBS people came up with? The only non-service
academy.
Yeah, to not have a completion to a wide receiver. So it's a turning of the page. I think both of those guys are capable of playing at this level. I mean, clearly Harrison Wallace is capable of playing at this level. Amari Evans we're still hearing about him making that transition from quarterback, late this season, which was a little bit troubling to me. I mean, he's been around a while, but whatever they were doing wasn't working with what Hagen's style, and James Franklin made his commitment, and that's the direction they're going.
These were by far the two most active, productive. I shouldn't say active because Liam Clifford and Julian Fleming were out there, but in terms of actually seeing passes their way, catching balls, missing some targets, these were the two storyline receivers down the stretch for Penn State: Amari Evans and Harrison Wallace. On the season combined, slightly more than 1,100 yards, 9 touchdowns. I went over some of the stats on our last episode of the podcast, so I won't do it again, but a huge bulk of Amari Evans' production came against Group of 5 opponents in West Virginia versus Big Ten opponents in SMU and Notre Dame. But Daniel, to bring it back to you and what's left in that room, that 2022 class at different points has featured 6 different receivers when we factor in Christian Driver and Mekhi Flowers, both going from defensive back to receiver. Christian Driver moved on last offseason to Minnesota. Flowers entered the portal. We know that Tyler Johnson's going down to ECU, East Carolina. And then, of course, Amari Evans from that class looking for his next home. That leaves Anthony Ivy, who has yet to really do anything of note in a game for Penn State at receiver. And then Caden Saunders, who was the primary punt returner for this team, a former top 100 prospect. Maybe some people surprised a bit to see these names still on the roster. But that's where things stand. That's all that's left from those 2022 classes. And this 2021 holdover is Liam Clifford, a redshirt senior. And so where does the rest of this get filled in? We have a lot of respect for the tight end room. We know there's going to be some drop-off when you go from losing an all-timer and what Tyler Warren did this year, but it's a really strong group. We don't know much about this receiver group. Kyron Hudson coming in from USC, and then from Troy, you've got Devontae Ross, 2 guys that Tyler Calvaruso and I covered in some good length last episode. And then it's, okay, well, is Tysier Denmark ready to take the next step up, which he wasn't able to do this year, and it looked like a position room that there was room to do that for a freshman. Peter Gonzalez coming off an injury. Josiah Brown was a practice element, and that was all he was as a freshman player. 4 more freshmen, and it's kind of like not a lot of obvious answers in that group as well. Daniel, if you had to take your pick from everything I just threw your way, receiver, who do you think are maybe the 2 or 3 components that you'd hang your hat on going into spring ball, coming out of spring ball, and being decently positioned to take the next step forward for this offense?
I mean, it's going to be interesting. I mean, that's really all it comes back to, because
we're holding you to this, Daniel. You better be right.
I know, I'm just gonna talk for like 2 minutes and then hope there's a point in there. I mean, we'll see. I mean, I think that we talked about the offensive line after the 2021 season, where James Franklin was like, all right, they got to prove it. I'm done talking about it. I think the wide receivers are in a little bit of a similar situation. I think it's a little bit different because you have so many new pieces coming in, and you have those freshmen who didn't play, the incoming freshmen, the 2 transfers. I think that there's a lot of unknown right now, but I do think that you look to Kyron Hudson and Devontae Ross. I know that Penn State fans have gotten burned in terms of the transfer portal wide receiver in the past, who was supposed to come in and be the guy. But then you also had Mitch Tinsley a couple years ago, who was a very, very solid player. Of course, he did that while playing with a future NFL draft pick in Parker Washington, and then Keandre Lambert-Smith, who had a very nice year for Auburn this year statistically. So you really wonder who is going to be the ones to step up. I think that with Kyron Hudson, maybe you think, okay, we know where his floor is. What happens when you open up a little bit more in the opportunity front? You open his targets maybe a little bit more. Maybe that production follows. Devontae Ross, you're making that jump from the Sun Belt, but we all saw what he did to Iowa last year. That was pretty impressive. Penn State goes back to Kinnick Stadium this year, and you're coming from the Sun Belt, which I think, if you want to make a comparison to like Dante Cephas coming up, I do think that the Sun Belt, the level of competition might be a little bit higher than the MAC. Cephas did have production against Power 5 teams, I believe, when he did come up. So we'll see. I think that this spring is going to be really interesting, and it's a good opportunity for someone like Caden Saunders to reestablish himself. I think coming out of spring last year, people were high on him. I remember we talked to him after the blue-white game. He was kind of put out there as a spokesman for that position group when we didn't know what Keandre Lambert-Smith was doing. He wasn't there. There are some interesting dynamics there. So, I think that we'll wait and see. Blue-white game is April 26th, so it's a little bit more than 3 months away. We'll finally get a little bit of a look in a game type environment, and maybe we'll learn something. But I do think that what Mark brought up in terms of these are all Hagen's guys now. I think that maybe if you factor that in, plus we heard a lot of good things about what Julian Fleming was able to bring from the culture side, maybe you do have a little bit of a reset. Maybe some of these guys feel like they've been around for a while, feel like they might have a little bit more of a fresh start. And maybe these guys who are coming in are walking into a little bit more of a blank slate where they can make their own impact and there's a little bit more room to grow.
It's a position group that will remain under the microscope for us here in the podcast. Don't worry. We'll bring it up again between now and the blue-white game.
Tyler, one quick thing.
Yeah.
I mean, it was mid-December when James Franklin said people weren't talking enough about the wide receivers, right?
Yeah. No. That was like 5 days before the Orange Bowl.
January 4th.
All right. So just so we're on the same page, we're talking about the receivers a lot now, aren't we? And I think we're going to be straight through spring practice and up till preseason practice, and rightfully so. I mean, you can't have the sort of performance they had in that game and not have it be an area of focus.
And I wasn't going to bring that up, but now that you have, I just wanted to add one more note there, because the receivers he had to be talking about, because we only saw 4 of them, right? Unless he's talking about these guys who step on the practice field, I don't think you're talking about practice field work in an Orange Bowl press conference. We're talking about the receivers stepping up, playing their role in games. And so there's 4 guys he would have been talking about, right? 2 of them are in the portal. 1 is going to be playing the SEC. We'll find out where Omari Evans goes. Julian Fleming is going to try to get on an NFL roster. And then you've got Liam Clifford, who's a 5th-year senior. And so outside of that, the evaluation process for James Franklin, Tyler Johnson had the 5th most reps, I think about 80 total snaps on the season, and about a third of those against Penn State. He's at ECU. So what James Franklin was talking about, seeing progress from the room on game days, at this point you're left with saying, okay, Liam Clifford took a step forward under Marcus Higgins. And that's all we can really definitively point to. Unfortunately, and I don't know if it would have turned out differently for him as a freshman than Tyser Denmark, but I think we're all quite high on Peter Gonzalez, and probably more high than a lot of people on this Penn State beat and a lot of maybe Penn State observers, because we saw him in person really earn his way into that 2024 class. He didn't get to campus until last summer, but he's somebody that I thought was really going to have a chance because of where he was physically and mentally for this program. Could have made some strides. Unfortunately, was it week 2 preseason camp? He's banged up. He's sidelined. So someone will be keeping a close eye. And again, we'll pick up the storyline later on this winter on the receiver situation. Let's get into Penn State's quickly their finish from 2024 season, but really how their outlook is shaping up for 2025. They finished number 5 in the AP poll that dropped this week after Ohio State beat Notre Dame for the championship. 13-3, and as Daniel Gallen pointed out to us when those rankings dropped, they lost to the number 1 team in the country, Ohio State, the number 2 team in the country, Notre Dame, and the number 3 team in the country, Oregon. They beat the other 13 opponents they faced. Penn State was number 8 in the preseason top 25, and this is their 5th top 10 finish in the last 9 seasons. And Daniel, when you put all that together, I think we probably all in agreement that Penn State exceeded expectations, but is it that obvious, or are they right about where you thought they'd end up? I know it's easy to say now that it felt like they exceeded expectations, but kind of remember that we picked them to beat Ohio State when they were unbeaten back in early November. So we did have high expectations for this program months ago. Yeah,
I think that coming into the season, the minimum that was expected was hosting a home playoff game at Beaver Stadium. I think that that's where a lot of the expectations were, that, okay, this team has been in that 5 to 8 range a lot over the past couple of years. That means that you're hosting, and they got there at the end. So I think overall they met expectations. I think that once they got into the college football playoff, I think they exceeded those expectations a little bit. I know I do think that maybe coming into the year, might have been, you could see them in the final 8. I don't know if I necessarily saw them in the final 4 with where we were in August, and given what happened with some other teams from around the country and how things went. But yeah, I think that when you put everything together with their resume, it's a pretty impressive season. Not only did they not lose, only lost to numbers 1, 2, and 3. All those losses were by 1 score. And then you look at what they did. They had 3 ranked wins against Boise State, which I think was number 7. SMU was 11 or 12, and Illinois was 16. And those were 3 double-digit victories over ranked teams and top 16 teams. So I think that shows a really good body of work for Penn State over the course of the year. They'd never won 13 games before. Obviously, you're swimming in a different pool with that this year with how things are. That first top 5 finish since 2005. I think that overall, I think that you can say that this season exceeded some expectations. But when you think back to where we were in August, it was, okay, this team needs to be in the playoff, and then we'll see what happens with pathway and things like that. So I think, kind of in line, maybe a little bit above expectations.
Mark, how about you? Just weighing in on the same subject there.
Typically I don't put a lot of stock in the AP poll because I think the worst people possible are voting in it. And I'm not saying people are biased. I'm saying we both covered a team. And to have beat writers voting on this stuff is insane. There's no way you could possibly chart it all. However, in this instance, listen, maybe it's maybe it's nitpicking, but between 4 and 5. But I don't know who watches those playoffs and thinks, okay, Texas belongs ahead of Penn State. Again, does it really matter? Probably not. But you would assume that the majority of people who are voting in the poll are actually able to watch those games because they're not covering, or if they are covering games, it's not nearly as many. So I just don't kind of quite get that. And then you lose to the number 2 team by 3 points in a game where you were kind of, dominating for a lot of that game. That doesn't really, I don't quite get that. But having said all that, does it make a bit of difference for them in recruiting or anything else? No, it doesn't. I mean, I think, if I'm voting, I have them number 4. Not that anybody would ever let me vote. Clearly, Oregon didn't represent itself very well in the playoff, but beat Penn State head to head. So I think you have to give them a lot of credit for handling that when it mattered. But beyond that, I think they're right around where they ought to be. I give Notre Dame all the credit in the world because I don't think that's a super talented team. I don't. And I think it's an extremely well-coached team. And I think it's a team that, generally speaking, performed very well in the clutch and deserves that number 2 spot. They earn that. So when I say I don't think it's a super talented team, I think if you line them up with the other top 4 teams and go athlete for athlete, I don't think they're quite there. But to me, that's actually a compliment because when you looked at what they were able to do in clutch games, what they were able to do with turnovers, with defense, with special teams, I mean, all those things, just very impressed by what Notre Dame did. I think Penn State's probably kicking itself for the way it lost that Notre Dame game. But end of the day, nobody's going and giving wins back. Nobody's going and saying, Penn State shouldn't have beaten USC. Penn State shouldn't have beaten, Minnesota. You never want to give those back. So you have to give the teams that win the close games credit because that's part of what this is all about. So 1, 2, 3, I think are great. I think Penn State should have been 4. And then after that, I don't know. I also went, and it's fun to look up, who's voting for who in these polls. And somebody actually voted a 4-loss Alabama team, number 11. And it's like, you look at this stuff and it's like, what is even going on here? Like, who is voting in these things? And I'm not naming names, but it's like, are people even watching what's going on and who these teams are losing to? So somebody actually voted Alabama number 11, which I thought was pretty funny.
No, these rankings don't matter anymore. We'll talk about the early 2025 rankings that dropped from 24/7 Sports this week. I just wanted to note that it feels like, Penn State, to get to that Final Four scenario, to pick up 13 wins along the way. First time they finished 11-1 under James Franklin, and yet I think there's still a portion of the fan base, because it's going to ring a little hollow than it should, because of the way the college football path laid out for them. I think Boise State finished number 8 in the final rankings. You had SMU finish number 12, and those are impressive wins, but they didn't walk off the field from matchups in which they were expected to lose, or whether it was considered a coin flip. They were a favorite against SMU. They were a favorite against Boise State. They were a favorite in the other 11 matchups that they won over the course of the season. They were not a favorite against Ohio State. Again, coin flip game against Notre Dame, and obviously against Oregon, they were an underdog as well. And so I think that's the one thing that remains missing. When you look at the moments of the season as they stacked up, fans want to see it. It's what's going to be required to break through the next level. Win that coin flip game against another great / elite team. Win that game where people are projecting you to lose it. And that's how Penn State finds themselves maybe in the final 2 next year. But I would say overall, it exceeded expectations, I think, based on where we thought the things were going to happen. There's different scenarios that can play out, but I think overall, you get to 13-3. You're one of the final 4 teams. I think you consider that a step above where we really thought it might be, coming off a 10-3 year against the Peach Bowl and those opt-outs and what you kind of people were wondering about a little bit culturally with Penn State. Daniel, as we look at turning the page towards next season, the early rankings from 24/7 Sports have Texas and Arch Manning at number 1. They've got Georgia at number 2. Ohio State, the reigning national title winner, at number 3, Penn State 4, Oregon 5, and you got 3 Big Ten teams there again in the top 5, a couple SEC squads ahead of them. Sound about right to you? I mean, it is so far down the road, but I think this kind of presents well for Penn State in terms of what people can expect for the national conversation because of what they brought back, where they reached this winter, and ultimately what some teams are losing around them.
Yeah, I feel like the combination of getting the sets of way too early rankings and then having that national championship game on Monday night with Ohio State winning, your mind immediately goes to November 1st in Columbus, Ohio. And then maybe a little after that, September 27th at Beaver Stadium with Oregon and Oregon coming to town. I think that that's where your mind goes, because what we've talked about with this Penn State team is that, like you laid out, Tyler, is that you always beat who you're supposed to beat. And then it's just that next tier that really, really stands out to you. And to have 2 of those teams in a way too early, top 25, top 5 with you, I think it lays out where the stakes are right now. But I do think overall, in looking through some of those rankings, I think 24/7 Sports, I think we had 6 or 7 Big Ten teams in the top 25, 10 SEC teams in the top 25. I think that it's an example of the nature of college football right now, where you have these 2 conferences that have the most talent, the best teams, the best coaches, the best players, and then it's going to be a question of attrition to get to the end of the year. You look at some of the SEC teams that were on the outside looking in, like an Alabama, like an Ole Miss, like a South Carolina, like just don't lose 3 games. Don't lose to Kentucky at home. Don't lose to Vanderbilt. All of those different things. I think that it gets really magnified that, the whole thing about the 12-team playoff was that, okay, you have a little bit more wiggle room, but then at the same time, these conferences are getting deeper. Your schedule is getting a little bit tougher, and it eliminates a little bit of that margin for error because of the way these leagues are. But I think right now, I think Penn State is certainly in that top 5 range going into the season. I believe Stuart Mandel at The Athletic had Penn State number 1. There's going to be a lot of hype around this team when you get Drew Aller back, when you get Denai Dennis Sutton back, Nick Singleton, Katron Allen, Zane Durant, and then you talk about the veteran, someone like Nick Dawkins coming back too, JB Nelson. I mean, you're going to need every single bit of your roster if you want to get in deep into January, and for Penn State to return some of these headliners. And you've seen what they've done in the transfer portal in terms of augmenting depth at a couple different positions, I think that you feel really good about where Penn State is. And I think that they have a little bit of a proof of concept too of getting into the national semifinals, of having a run last year. So, obviously this is based a little bit on projection, but at the same time, you have a little bit of a proof of concept where you can say, hey, this team has been here before. This team got into the postseason and won some games. They're in a good position to make some noise.
Yeah, playoff experience across the roster. It's a new thing that we're going to get used to across college football because it's not such an exclusive company to get to that point in the postseason anymore. And that top 10 from 24/7 Sports is rounded out by number 6, Clemson, number 7, Notre Dame, number 8, Alabama, number 9, Tennessee, and number 10, SMU, who we saw fall here in Beaver Stadium about a month ago. Mark, the betting industry sees a very similar top 5, but kind of shuffles up the projected power rankings, as it were, with Ohio State having the number 1 odds for a national championship to repeat next year. This is per FanDuel. Ohio State's number 1. Then you've got Oregon and Texas plus 650 at number 2. Ohio State, by the way, plus 450. Georgia plus 700. Then Penn State follows number 5 plus 850. Mark, you've covered plenty of Penn State seasons that have had considerable lead up and expectations surrounding them. I'd have to say maybe going back to the 2017 season that followed the Big Ten championship run, when you had a junior version of Saquon Barkley and you had a junior version of Trace McSorley. Maybe that's the last time that everyone's going to be talking about championships as openly and publicly, fans, players, coaches alike, I think. Am I right with that read, or am I missing a year in between? And what do you view this year as a moment for James Franklin? We are now in year 12 of his career with the Nittany Lions.
Yeah, that's probably it. But I mean, I think the difference now is, the offensive line is, I think that's being overlooked. I mean, we could talk about Aller and Singleton and Katron Allen all we want, and rightfully so. I mean, they're all very good players, and the tight ends are terrific, and I'm sure they'll figure something out at wide receiver. But, when you look at what they have at the offensive line, and I just think so many times when you look at these early rankings and whatnot, I think everybody's so focused on the skill position players. But if you look, generally speaking, the teams with the best lines are the ones who are going to be there at the end of the day. And I look at Penn State's offensive line, and you think about Donko coming back. You look at the way that Rucci played. You're bringing in a kid from the transfer portal. I mean, I don't remember this much depth going into the season. And we're starting to stack those, by the way, right? I mean, we're starting to say, I don't remember this much depth, even when they had a lot of depth last year and then the previous year. And why is that important? Because A, the more offensive linemen you have, the better. But B, what have we seen the last couple of years? They've lost guys to injuries, either for major portions of the season or entire seasons, or Landon Tangwell, his career ending. So the talent that they've been able to stack. And then I think if you look over on the defensive line, yeah, obviously you're losing Abdul Carter, but again, I mean, I think you look at Zane Durant and Denai Dennis Sutton, and you talk about guys, we're going to talk about guys carrying momentum in the next season. I don't know that Penn State could be better positioned, realistically speaking. In this day and age with the transfer portal, and we saw it last year where I think some guys made some decisions to go into the NFL draft who may ultimately have regretted it. I don't know. Maybe they didn't. But I don't think Penn State could be much better positioned overall. They have to figure out what's going on at wide receiver, but I don't know that would have been a given had they not lost the 2 guys that they lost. To me, Kobe King is going to be the most difficult guy to replace on defense. That's not a knock on Jalen Reed, but I just think you have other safeties who are capable. I mean, we saw it with Zakee Wheatley, the way that he kind of elevated his game and the way they've recruited at those positions. So to me, I think they're as well positioned, Tyler, since the late 90s, maybe that 99 season. I know I'm going pretty far back, and I know that didn't necessarily work out well for Penn State, but when you look at the depth of talent they had back then, I think you're looking at kind of a similar type situation. And hopefully, if you're a Penn State fan, it works out better than that 99 season worked out. But going into that season, they were pretty well loaded.
Daniel, it's a long off season. There's a lot of TV segments to fill, a lot of podcasts to fill, including this one. And Drew Aller is going to be someone who gets brought up a bunch because Penn State's going to be discussed a bunch in the grand scheme of things, as we just discussed with Mark. You're talking about maybe a 25-year span since the last time there was this much championship hype around Penn State football. I mean, I know Abdul Carter had a hell of a season. People are talking about him maybe being the number one pick in the NFL draft. But when you were the quarterback, it's just a different kind of light that shines down upon you. And Drew Aller, number 3, at least tied for number 3 in early Heisman odds from FanDuel. Number 1 on that list is Garrett Nussmeier, who put up 4,000 yards as a starter for LSU this season. Number 2, Arch Manning, 13 total touchdowns as the backup quarterback for Texas behind Quinn Ewers. He's stepping up, the nephew of Eli and Peyton. And then behind him, you got a few guys there for the number 3 spot with plus 1,200 odds. It's Drew Aller, it's Clemson quarterback Cade Klubnik, and it's Ohio State sophomore receiver Jeremiah Smith, who, again, put on a show late in that national championship game. So, Daniel, last we saw Drew Aller, you were front and center. You were asking him questions. It was another emotional post-game press conference, but we're a couple weeks removed from that. You start to get in that mindset that 2025 is around the corner. He's going to be a senior. There's going to be this kind of attention for him, and it's just going to be, hey, what does that do to him? And ultimately, how does he come out the other side from it? Because he is going to face a level of scrutiny because of how it ended in 2024, how it ended a couple weeks ago, and because of the expectations now in place where he's a top 3 Heisman Trophy odds recipient. And this is a big moment in the spotlight for a guy who's been used to the attention going back to his senior year of high school, but stepping up big time now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the general consensus from the public when it comes to Drew Aller is that they're just going to want to see it from him. You know, they're going to want to see all the stuff that they've heard about him in these big games. I think that is something that with Aller that was a big, I think, national takeaway, from that Orange Bowl was that, people have heard so much about him over these past couple of years, and you look at what he did in these big spotlight games in his 2 years as a starter, and it left a little bit to be desired from him. So I think that he's going to be firmly in the spotlight from the jump this year. And I think that when you go through the guys who have those short Heisman odds, it's a really interesting group that I think you could consider to be wide open. I know that going into last year, I know Travis Hunter had a ton of attention and, had very high expectations that he lived up to. But you look at those guys in that same category as Drew Aller and feels wide open. So I think people are going to want to see him take that jump, take a step forward, and show up in some of these big games. I know in the last segment, I talked about Oregon on September 27th, Ohio State November 1st. People are going to tune in, and they're going to want to see Drew Aller. They're going to want to see that right arm, and they're going to want to see him making plays.
I think you're muted, Tyler.
Mic issue there for a quick moment there. But yeah, it's going to be a spotlight off season. We're going to be hearing about this team from different venues and different outlets, maybe in a way, in a volume that we're not used to hearing it. But that's what Penn State has done for itself. James Franklin talks about the consistency of being a team that's contending. He's proven that to a key level and still another step ahead, but there's going to be a lot of attention on them. We wanted to close up this episode spending 10 solid minutes on Penn State basketball. And I know it's a big ask of Mark and Daniel to say, well, tell us about the first 19 games of this Penn State season in 10 minutes. But we haven't spent really any time on this show talking hoops, and that'll change as they move forward, especially if they pick up some wins and get that March Madness conversation. But Mark, talk us through where things stand right now for Penn State basketball in the season. They are 13-6 on the year, and they are 3-5 in the Big Ten. Had a really hot start to get things going. Year 2 under head coach Mike Rhodes. As best you can, summarize where we are at this point and how we got here.
Hot start, not a good non-conference schedule. Brutal start to January in Big Ten play, and now things are coming back down to earth. I mean, they were in a situation where they played three teams that were ranked in the top 15. Am I right about that? One after another, and in January, and that's just very difficult to do They obviously were blown out Illinois. I don't think you could make too much of that. Illinois blew out Oregon. In Oregon, you're seeing teams with this goofy schedule, the way it's working out, with teams traveling all over the place, getting blown out here and there, but then dropped a tough game to Oregon and then dropped a 5-point game to Michigan State. I think if they're able to win one of those, they would be much better positioned now with another quad one win. But they really have to start taking care of business at this point. The one thing I like, Daniel and I were both there when they beat Rutgers. For years, Steve Peichel at Rutgers has kind of hung his hat on having, 8 sixth-year seniors, and they're going to be the team that doesn't crack at the end of the game. So Penn State's in this game. You have 2 of the top freshmen in the nation, 2 of the top 3 freshmen in the nation that you're going up against. And Penn State had lost 4 straight games, and it would have been real easy to kind of roll over, but they didn't. Penn State's a veteran team, found itself in a very tight spot. Ace Bailey from Rutgers played an exceptional game, but when the game was on the line, he had 2 key technical fouls, and Penn State capitalized on both of them and ends up getting out of there with a win that was absolutely imperative for keeping their NCAA tournament hopes alive. So they're at Iowa on Friday night. Then they're at Michigan on Monday. I mentioned earlier about how goofy the schedule is. It's just ridiculous that they're playing Rutgers opposite the national championship football game, on Peacock. Like the Big Ten is trying to ensure that as few people as possible watch these games, I assume.
What was the other game? They just yanked one of the games. So they just said it's not going to be televised anymore.
That was the Drexel game.
Right.
In Philly. That was opposite the SMU game.
Yeah, but there's nothing you could do about that. I mean, that just so happened. But then, so then they just decided not to televise it. But that you can't control. And that's the one thing I like about Rhodes is he has kept this team after they got smoked at Illinois. Again, I mentioned it for the Rutgers game. It would have been real easy to just say, this isn't going to work out. But they've regrouped and they're right there. I mean, the issue is they've lost Puff Johnson. And it looks like that could be a season-ending thing. They have not announced it as a season-ending thing, but when you look at the brace on his right hand, and you start charting how much time is left in this season, you start wondering. And the issue with that is he gave them a lot of options. He could play the 5 if he needed to. He could play the 4. He could play the 3. Very vocal leader, so not having him is tough. But generally speaking, they're still a veteran team. And they're going to be in positions where they may not have as much overall talent as their opponent, but they're that team with all those veterans who is going to have to capitalize on what lays ahead. So they're at Iowa Friday night, 9 p.m. Great time for everybody here on the East Coast to watch a basketball game. Iowa just kind of was on the verge of being blown out by Minnesota and then kind of rallied, ended up losing a relatively tight one. But that's a winnable game. So these are the games that they have to win. They have an opportunity to make the NCAA tournament. It's not going to be easy. They're going to have to pick off a couple of games that they're expected to lose. But that's kind of where it is. I know that's a long way to go, but a lot's been cooking since last we talked about hoops.
That trip to Iowa will be the final, the first of 3 in a 7-day span to close out the month of January. Also traveling to Michigan, currently ranked 21, and then closing out the month against Ohio State at the BJC back home. That's where they beat. What's that? It's that Rec Hall. I'm sorry. Thank you for the correction. So that'll be a fun atmosphere shaping up for their next game here on campus. They've got a couple of road games before then. But Daniel, Mark laid it out there. It's a team that started out 6-0. They were 8-1 with a win over a Purdue team that ranked in the top 10. And then you get to Big Ten play and then the meteor schedule. And come early January, you drop 4 straight. Pick up that win, which, as Mark pointed out, felt pretty darn important on Monday to get to 13-6, to right the ship and snap that 4-game schedule. A lot of Big Ten play to left. And with Puff Johnson out of the equation, bring us up to speed on what the rotation of players looks like and where the roles are kind of fitting right now, because there's 5 other players beyond Puff Johnson who are averaging double digits in points, and 2 of them are first-year players with the program.
Yeah, I think that this year you've seen Mike Rhodes construct a very balanced roster. And he was asked about that earlier today at our media availability with him. And, I think that, every once in a while you'll see Ace Baldwin take over a game, whether that's at the free throw line or getting to the basket, and be a big time volume scorer. But you look around and they've had different guys pop up at different times. DeMarco Dunn had a really nice game at Michigan State. Nick Kern had a nice game in the starting lineup against Rutgers. Yannick Conan Niederhauser, the big 7-footer who transferred in from Northern Illinois, he's scored in double figures in back-to-back Big Ten games after not reaching 10 points in the first 6 Big Ten games of the year. So you look at the sum of their parts and what they have, and it's a very interesting group that can beat you in a couple different ways. Can do some different things to you. So it's a fun group. I think Rhodes did a nice job this offseason of filling in some holes through the portal, rebalancing the roster in terms of your age distribution. So you don't have a ton of 6th-year seniors or 5th-year seniors that you're going to have to replace. And I think that coming into Big Ten play, though, you've still had some questions. Like Mark said, that non-conference schedule was not good. My alma mater is going through something similar, where they also played a horrendous non-conference schedule, and then you get into Big Ten play, and you're kind of like, whoa, this is a little bit different. But I think the one thing about a Rhodes team that we've learned is that they're going to fight. That this isn't a team that really rolls over, and I think that some of that comes from Rhodes. I think some of that also comes from Ace Baldwin and his approach, how he plays the game, and we saw that against Rutgers. So I think that if they lose that game to Rutgers, the tenor of our conversation, I think we might be starting to fill in some blanks on the obituary, but they're going to have a chance to get a winnable game at Iowa, potentially get a signature win against Michigan. And then once you get into February, Mark alluded to this, and Rhodes has been talking about it with just how wonky the schedule has been in terms of travel, and like you're going Friday, Sunday on the road, just some weird quirks in there. Once you get into February, you get into a little bit more of a rhythm, with games on Tuesdays and Saturdays, and then games on Wednesdays and Saturdays to close the year. You do have the cross-country flight for UCLA and USC mixed in there. But I think that when you get into that rhythm, I think that this team, if they can stack a couple wins over the next week, then get into this rhythm, really get into the stretch run, I think that they'll be well positioned to make a little bit of noise. Is that going to be enough? What is it going to take to get into the NCAA tournament? I think that'll become a little bit more clear. But Joe Lunardi had them in that, I think, second 4-out range. So they're in the mix. And it's just going to be, can you keep it together? Can you avoid some of these stumbles if you want to get there?
Penn State finished 16-17 in year one under Rhodes, narrowly missed a chance to compete in the postseason at some level. And in this case, you still have your focus clearly trying to be one of those 68 teams that gets the chance to be in the dance, Mark. And Daniel referenced that right. They're one of one of the next 4 out. You have the first 4 out, they're the next 4 out. So let's just say they're part of those first 8 out of the bracket as things stand now. You got some other Big Ten teams in there as well. Ohio State and Iowa are on that list. And I know 24/7 Sports just put out their rankings for the top 68 teams in college basketball. They did include Penn State on that, but they do not get a vote with that selection committee when the time comes. So, Mark, what's it going to take between now and when that committee sits down and puts together its bracket to ensure that Penn State is back in March Madness?
Yeah, as I mentioned, they're going to have to pick off some wins that they're not expected to win. I mean, as I look down the schedule now, I mean, Iowa is almost like a must-win for them. And I hate to say that, but it's like if that's a team that you ought to be able to beat. Michigan would be a nice win to pick off. I mean, you should be counting on winning that Ohio State game, even though Ohio State's playing pretty well. You go on the road for UCLA and USC. Can you get one of those? I mean, those are the kind of things that they're going to have to do. The other player I wanted to mention that we didn't mention, Daniel, and that was on me as well, is Freddie DeLeon. I mean, yes. The Tennessee transfer, the last few games has really started to play the way I think a lot of us expected him to be playing all year. Didn't have the greatest game against Michigan State, but it's kind of sandwiched that two really good games around that. But he's a guy who gives them a lot of versatility. If Ace Baldwin's out, he can handle the ball a little bit for you. He can help you break the press. has played really well. And then they just need Zach Hicks to keep bombing in threes. At times he's been reluctant, but he can't afford to be reluctant. He's got to get out there and bomb it. I think was it the last 4 minutes against Michigan State, he hit 4 3-pointers, and he was 0 of 3 before that. So these are guys who have their roles. And I'm mentioning these names because, as Daniel noted, they don't necessarily have to have one guy be a star, the same guy be the star every night. Like if you look at Rutgers, if they don't have Bailey or Harper playing exceptionally well every night, they're not going to have an opportunity to win. Whereas Penn State, they can afford a little bit of an off game from Ace Baldwin. Not a completely off game, but maybe one game he doesn't have to score. Maybe it's assists. Maybe Freddie De Leon picks up the scoring. Maybe Conan picks up the scoring in one game. Maybe it's Hicks. So that's what I think actually will serve them well and give them an opportunity to go out and maybe pick off some of these wins. But they're definitely going to have to do it because they scheduled down their non-con. They scheduled down with I know the idea was to build up wins and to get confidence and that sort of thing. And there's give and take on both ends of that. But then you get into the conference season. Right now, Ken Palm has them going 9-11, and I'm not sure if that gets you into the tournament.
We will stay tuned, and we'll see if they give us a little bit more to chat about basketball related here on the podcast moving forward. Daniel and Mark will be on coverage at Lions247.com throughout the remainder of this season. And of course, football offseason is a big show in town all the time, and we'll be on that. Big recruiting weekend, the first of a few of those in the course of this winter months, coming our way. Saturday, Junior Day here on campus. Tyler Calvaruso, Brian Doan, and our recruiting crew at 24/7 Sports have been on that. A lot of updates at 24/7 Sports in terms of who's making the trip, what they're talking about coming back to campus, and we'll have a lot of feedback coming off of those visits. So let's get over to Lions247.com for the latest in recruiting, because that's starting to heat up again. Transfer portal conversations ongoing, and when the defensive coordinator is ultimately hired by Penn State, we'll have more for you there. We'll have more for you here on the podcast. For now, on behalf of Mark and Daniel, I am Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.